Nolan, how are you doing today?
I'm fantastic. Thanks. How are you, Will?
Doing great, doing great. And just for the listeners, I'm joined today as well by Lars Doucet, a frequent co-contributor here, especially on the land policy side of things. Um,
Howdy, folks.
well, Nolan, do you mind giving us a brief bio and some of the big ideas you're interested in?
Yeah, totally. I'm a professional city planner. I was a city planner in New York City, in Queens specifically. And I'm really interested in land use planning and how we govern the growth of cities, how we manage the growth of cities. So in the US context, that means looking at things like zoning, subdivision regulations, and how these have a huge impact in shaping what cities look like and how they work or don't work. And right now, I'm also working on a PhD in city planning at UCLA.
So real quick, just for the normies here, which includes me, what does a city planner actually do? When a normie like me hears that, you kind of think someone's playing SimCity, but in real life. So what is your actual mandate in like the role of a city planner when you have that job? And what are the official limitations and what are the functional limitations on what you can and can't do?
Yeah, that's a really great question. What is a city planner? Yeah, I think you're exactly right that most people have a SimCity conception of city planning, right? Where, there's like this board of technocrat deities who manage everything about cities day to day. And kind of couldn't be further from the truth in a lot of respects. Maybe in different political or historical contexts, it was more like that. But in a contemporary US context, the planner can be a lot of things, right? So it can be someone basically doing code enforcement, making sure that the hedges or the fences are the right height or not too tall, all the way up to people who are doing long range planning, right? So people who are putting together capital plans for cities. So, what are going to be our big infrastructure investments over the next 10 to 15 years? So there's a range of different types of planning that happen, among those different levels, right? So you have planners who are focused on environmental planning. So protecting sensitive natural areas, dealing with things like stormwater management and sewer management, dealing with things like air quality. You have planners who are more focused on land use planning, which is my specialization. So regulating growth, regulating the built environment, what can be built where, what types of uses and at what scale. You have planners who do historic preservation. You have planners who do economic development. So it's kind of a catch-all title for anyone and everyone who has anything to do with policy at the city or metropolitan level.
So you play quite a few different roles there. It really is dependent on where you are in in context dependent, it sounds like.
Yeah, and you really do specialize pretty intensely. You kind of have to. I mean, it's the planning profession prides itself as being jack of all trades, but in most cases you'll specialize pretty heavily. And there are planners who do the types of things that I think the average person thinks a planner does, right? So parks management, planning out parks, planning out street grids, reviewing new subdivisions, stuff like that. That does still happen. But kind of back to the original point you were making, Lars, which is the SimCity view of city planning. In practice, planning is very, very, very political. And in many cases, practicing planners actually don't have a lot of leeway to sort of push their policy perspective. In many cases, you're kind of a bureaucrat that's kind of following political orders. It's not to say that there aren't great planners who
orders from whom?
Usually elected officials or the self-appointed leaders of community groups who can scare elected officials. To give you the cynical answer, I'm going to give you the cynical answers rather than the planning school theory answers.
Well, yeah, that's what we're actually here is because it's
right.
I asked earlier, it's what and I should know better than to do double-barreled questions. I'll just chop them up. What are the actual limits of the power, officially, in Platonic Spaceland, and what are the actual practical limits of the power as actually practiced in the field?
Yeah, I mean, so in theory, early planning institutions were designed to be kind of independent and insulated from the political process. The idea was you wanted to have an independent city planning commission. It might have been appointed by the mayor or the city council, and usually appointed by the mayor, and then an independent planning agency. And the idea was to set up institutions where these people could really act independent of political institutions, for better or worse, right? This is a very kind of, a modernist view of governance, right? We need to get the experts and then insulate them from the politics. And in our current situation where we're very much at the opposite end of that, it's kind of attractive. But today, it's much more of a political process, right? So in theory, right, what city planners are meant to be doing is they're going to sit down and write a 30-year comprehensive plan, pulling together demographic data and economic trends and, what does the city look like? What kind of infrastructure is it going to need? How are the demographics changing? How does that show up in service provision, stuff like schools and parks and transportation planning? Sit down. From that comprehensive plan, all functions of government are supposed to be sort of built around pursuing this plan. So, the street investments are going to be based on the comp plan. Where we open schools is going to be based on the comp plan. Where we open parks is going to be based on the comp plan. Where we allow housing and encourage housing versus where we try to disincentivize or block housing. It's all going to be built around this comprehensive plan that was supposed to be based on these big, economic and demographic principles. In practice, a lot of cities actually don't even have a comprehensive plan. And in many more urban contexts where there is a comprehensive plan, there's actually no legal requirement that cities follow it. So it ends up becoming a kind of perfunctory process, and things like zoning just become hyper politicized.
Cool. So I'll ask one more question and I'll let Will take the lead for the subsequent batch of questions. So you're brought on this podcast in part because of this book you've written. Do you want to tell us what the thesis of the book is and how it connects to the spiel you just gave us?
Yeah, so I just gave you a really big picture spiel on how city planning works. And it's big and it's messy. And it's also hard to generalize about because it varies based on state and local rules. So, city planning in DC works very different from city planning in San Francisco, for example. Chicago and a planner in Chicago might move to a place like Miami and not kind of have any real sense of how the planning works. Maybe that's not the case, but it's certainly possible. So my focus is on land use planning, the way we govern the growth of cities. In the US context, that's mostly things like zoning. So zoning does two things. Zoning segregates uses. So it says you can do residential here, commercial here, industrial there. And then, within those broad categories, there are districts for, innumerable thousands of different subcategories, right? So corner groceries as opposed to supermarkets, apartments as opposed to single family homes, light industrial as opposed to heavy industrial. So that's half of zoning. The other half of zoning is regulating the massing or the density of these developments. This is things like how close can a building sit to the property line? How tall can the building be? How much floor area can the building have? And again, these are going to vary based on district. As we're probably going to talk about over the course of this podcast, there are a lot of critiques of how zoning works in the US. In the book, I argue that it's made cities more unaffordable, important distinction. It's blocked people out of moving into high opportunity areas where they could, become more productive and increase their wages and make us all wealthier as a result. It's entrenched things like racial and economic segregation, things that we like to think we've moved past, but we very much haven't. And it also forces cities into a kind of sprawling, auto-oriented pattern of growth. And it's fine if you want to live in a context like that, but in zoning, we don't give anyone the option to live maybe in a neighborhood with a corner grocery or to live a life where they can take a bus or ride a bike to work. So, we know that zoning is broken and it's not getting us what we want. But there hasn't really been a lot of conversation about, we can reform zoning, and that's fantastic. And we'll talk about that as well. But, what would it look like to move past zoning? What do we want land use planning to do? At some level, we want incompatible uses to be separate. We would ideally like growth to be coordinated with infrastructure investments, of course, right? How can you argue with that? And we know that zoning hasn't achieved those, but what would it look like to have a land use planning system that does that? And zoning has kind of sucked all the air out of the room on these conversations. Like, well, we have this is how we do it. We have the system and we all know it doesn't really work, but we're going to tinker with it and make it slightly better. And I kind of just wanted to move the conversation to the next step. Like, no, like we all know the system's broken. Like, what would happen if we just tossed it and started over? What do we want land use planning to do?
I like how you talk about what comes after the revolution, because it's nice to talk about what the problem is and we'll just abolish X. And then once we've done that, everything will be fine. But I like that as a city planner, you're talking about what comes after. Now, Will, I'll let you ask any concrete follow-ups here because I've talked enough already, but this looks really interesting and spicy to me.
Well, after the revolution, they'll have to hire me and my consulting firm if they want the answers.
Very nice rate. Absolutely. Well, Nolan, I'm curious. Do you know much about the history of zoning? Like, how did we get here? And Yeah. How do we get here?
Yeah. So since the dawn of time, we have had land use planning. That's such a great like freshman way to start a point.
Yeah.
Since humans have lived in cities, we have had mechanisms that look like land use planning, right?
Okay.
So, regulations on building materials, which actually aren't usually in zoning codes today, but right. So historically, it would be like you can't have the exterior of your property be built with flammable products for obvious reasons, right? Or rules about distances between properties if they were, or rules on things like noxious uses, right? So before zoning, we had rules to say, hey, you just can't have a slaughterhouse in the middle of the city. Sorry, like we know it's going to be a problem. We know it's going to be smelly and noisy, and people aren't going to like it. Or rules segregating other disfavored uses, sometimes for what we would recognize as traditional externalities, sometimes for cultural reasons. Sexual or alcohol-related businesses, right? Zoning is a step beyond that, and right. So in the early 19 teens, at sort of the tail end of the progressive era, right around the time that we're adopting prohibition and things like eugenics are really popular, and not to completely mischaracterize this era, but just to emphasize the point that a lot of bad ideas that we scrapped were popular back then, and I would argue zoning is one of them. But in 1916, the first zoning ordinances come online, and they're different in the sense that they aspire to comprehensively catalog out all land uses and determine every square inch of the city where each use is going to go or to be allowed. And also, too, zoning takes a step further on stuff like massing rules. So historically, many cities did have height limits. They didn't have height limits because they were worried that an apartment building would block the sunlight that the lady needs for her zucchini garden, to use the infamous San Francisco example, but because if there was a fire, we needed to make sure that we could get the people safely out, right? And technology, fire abatement building technology, to say nothing of firefighting technology, was not sophisticated. So historically, cities have these things like setback and height limits, but they're very, very, very closely tailored to actual nuisances. And zoning kind of goes a step further to say, we're going to not only say where every use can be, even things that we don't historically think of as a nuisance, like an apartment building or a corner grocery, we're also going to rigidly determine what every single building is going to end up looking like in terms of the massing. We're going to have new residential subdivisions that are only single family homes, that have no commercial, where every home is set back 30 feet from the front, from the street, where every home has a large backyard. Very much a kind of a social planning vision, right? Like, because by being able to regulate these things, you're able to regulate what type of person is allowed to live where and what type of life they live. And so zoning has this sort of, much greater ambition than anything like city planning in the past. And as I try to argue in the book, there's maybe this like Disney quality. There's like this Disney story of zoning that I think a lot of planners are taught and reinforce as they do zoning day to day to clear their conscience. This idea like, in the early 1900s, industry was just starting in 1910, and there were smokestacks, and there were factories next to residential areas, and so like that's why we needed zoning. And if you actually dig into sort of like the road to zoning in places like New York City or Berkeley, it's very much more a sort of battle royale of special interests, right? So in the New York context, commercial landlords were irritated that industrial was moving near them. And they weren't upset about industrial because of any traditional negative externality. The Fifth Avenue retailers were upset that the poor Jewish factory girls who worked in those factories would come and walk around on the street and lower the class, the classiness of the street and scare off their upscale Anglo customers. Or in the Berkeley context, right, you see things like, we need to adopt industrial zoning. Okay, interesting. What kind of industries were they worried about? And it's invariably like a Chinese laundromat. And of course they were clever enough to say things like, oh, well, the laundromat's a fire hazard. But then it's like, oh, okay, well, like, why do you only bring up the Chinese laundromat? And we also know that there's this kind of really nasty history in California of anti-Asian discriminatory land use policy. So, zoning it has these really unusual and modern and very sort of technocratic ambitions. But it ultimately has kind of from its beginning served special interests. And that's what I'm trying to drive home in the book, that there's not this like Disney story of like, oh yeah, smokestacks next to schools and then planners came in and saved the day. It's much more complicated, and it much more reflects the way that we know zoning works today.
That makes a ton of sense. Those special interests. Can you describe who kind of the bootleggers and Baptists are of these interest groups? And the follow up question to that is how this is probably a bad word, defeatable are they, or like how possible is it for us to overcome this, as because it's like this crazy collective action problem, it feels like.
Just quickly to de-jargonify for anyone in the audience who doesn't know what bootleggers or Baptists is, it's two people you would assume are in opposition who actually kind of work together, whether if that sort of makes sense. Like the prohibitionist Baptists actually kind of benefit from the bootleggers and vice versa, who are making the illegal alcohol and so on.
Yeah, that's such a great question, and thanks for clarifying, Lars. This is I'm reviewing the final proofs on my book, and I think I used this metaphor like 4 times, and I might have to like actually tone it down a little bit. But it's such a useful lens for interpreting public policy. But so to your question, I think that's really crucial to understanding zoning, because you had the Baptists, right, who were these kind of high-minded government reformers who, they were kind of swept up with the times and
literal Baptists, or just metaphorically?
I think they were literally probably some variety of mainline Protestants. Yeah. I don't actually, yeah, I'm almost certain that's probably what they were. Because that's another element of this, right? That's another lens of like politics that's kind of faded away. This like being a mainline Protestant as like denoting your political views in some way, right? Like, because at the time, a lot of immigrants were Catholic, right? And people from Southern and Eastern Europe. Kind of put that tangent to the side now. But the Baptists in this context were people who, very understandably, like, let's use some of this human knowledge to, rationalize our cities, right? Like our cities are booming. And yeah, there are, like, in some cases, real land use conflicts that could have been prevented. Yeah, there are issues of congestion on the subway in the New York context, or issues of congestion in certain very high density parts of the city. There were problems that were ultimately solved by institutions other than zoning, right? So overcrowding in housing, right, which was partly a function of immigrants, being very poor and needing to crowd into areas where they could be near opportunity. We solved that with stuff like building and health and safety regulations. But so, you get this Baptist story for sure. The bootleggers, it really depends on the context. So as I mentioned in the New York City context, one of the main interest groups that pushed for zoning was the Fifth Avenue Association, an association of retailers along a very posh commercial district who were upset about the incursion of industrial. In other contexts, the principal bootleggers were homeowners who were irritated about apartments coming onto their block into maybe nice areas of the city where they lived. And rather than sort of, do it Cohesion style and pull together and pay, property owners not to develop their property in ways that upset them, or, voluntarily opt into covenants or deed restrictions, they turned to government to basically enforce their preferences and enforce their financial interests.
One thing that's really interesting about this is that it kind of seems like it's very much a heavy-handed, kind of modernist, centrally planned kind of vision. And we can go into that. But one thing I want to make sure we cover, just for the sake of, keeping ourselves honest here, is what are the benefits of zoning? You know what I mean? Like if we just try to be as fair as possible to zoning, what are the problems it doesn't just purportedly solve? What are the problems it actually solves? Right? And are there things like, I assume your case is that we can solve those things in other ways without all these problems, but what are the things like it legitimately does solve?
Yeah. I have actually a section in the book where I try to steelman zoning. And I think to touch on, I know you wanted actual solutions that come out of zoning, but I think the argument that we need mechanisms to prevent incompatible uses, and we need mechanisms to coordinate growth with infrastructure investment is obvious, right? I think there's no question in my mind. And exactly to your point, because zoning is around and because zoning is such a powerful tool, it often does end up getting drafted to do things that kind of look like city planning, right? So like we say to new developers, hey, if you want to build this big building, we're only going to let you do it if you dedicate some area on the ground floor for a public plaza. or, oh, if you want to build this apartment building, we're only going to allow it if you set aside 20% of the units to be income restricted for families earning 40 to 60% of the area median income. Everyone knows that we need some forms of subsidized housing. We can quibble about the form that takes, or everyone knows that a healthy city needs public plazas and public parks. But so zoning ends up getting drafted into a lot of these mechanisms, or occasionally for things like environmental regulations, right? So setbacks from waterways or setbacks from wetlands. Sometimes zoning is used to accomplish those. Other times not. It really just depends on the city. So with wetlands regulation, right, a city might adopt a wetlands ordinance, or a city might use zoning to accomplish that. I think a benefit, just to give the devil its due, I think one argument that a lot of people would make for zoning is they would say, well, zoning is how people get some say over new development that happens in their community. I think there's a YIMBY impulse to just kind of relentlessly make fun of that claim. I'm actually not totally unsympathetic to it. And I think it's reasonable that people would have some say in things like public investment or the general rules that are going to structure new development. I think the question is, what's the healthy way to sort of give people that say? Today, the way that zoning does it, and I'm sorry, Lars, I'm going to slip back into criticism here. The way that zoning does it is to say, all right, like when a building gets proposed, you can come and yell at the developer and also the city planner, and then we'll make the project smaller, or we'll just kill it. And that's you having your say. I think that's a very impoverished view of like public participation and participatory city planning. And I think another way we might do things is to say, let's take that comprehensive planning idea seriously. Like rather than sort of having these ad hoc public hearings where people just show up and yell and essentially their only option is to say no. Why don't we, in a systematic way, go out and survey people? What do you want in your community? What sorts of things do you want to see? Do scientific surveying, things like focus groups with a representative, cross section of the community.
Are you saying that what we've been doing is setting up a model where the council of the people who get to make the decisions just kind of go out and make a decision, and then they present it to the public, and then whoever's motivated enough to show up yells at them and tells them not to do it, and so they cut it down, and then you just wind up with something nobody wants? Or is that a mischaracterization?
So the way zoning works in most cities is you'll have a zoning ordinance that was written 25 to 50 years ago, and no politician wants to touch it because opening that up is going to be a huge headache. Just look at the situation in Austin, where they've been trying to rewrite Code Next for like 2 decades now. So nobody wants to touch it. So you have this old book of rules in a zoning ordinance that everyone agrees make absolutely no sense and don't allow the type of development that everyone agrees is necessary. But so rather than change that zoning, the system becomes, we'll come in and ask for discretionary relief. So come in and ask for a variance, or come in and ask for a special permit. We'll let you ignore those zoning rules, but you have to come and ask. And when that happens, you get this big case-by-case fight, because those things usually have to be approved by the local city council. And so rather than having these big picture discussions on like, let's sit down and do a 30-year comprehensive plan for our city, and then that comprehensive plan should force us to change elements of our zoning code to allow the type of development we know we need and we ultimately want. Instead, we get these case-by-case fights. These are the planning hearings that, fill up your local newspaper and drive, really extreme comment sections. And so, that's sort of the way that the participatory planning works under zoning.
That makes sense. I'm curious, Nolan, do you have hope for reforming zoning in the US and kind of defeating special interests when they come up? Or is this just kind of a pipe dream? Is this, obviously if you're working on it, you think it must be achievable.
Yeah. I go back and forth on what we're doing right now. There's moments where I think we're just keeping a tradition alive for when the moment aligns. And then there's moments where I think, wow, things really are changing. Here I'm in Los Angeles, which is kind of like an advanced case of zoning breaking a city, and ditto for San Francisco in a slightly different way. And here the problem of things like housing affordability and access into high opportunity regions has become so extreme that there finally is a coalition that can overcome all those special interests. And I think that's mostly what we've seen with things like the YIMBY movement, right? People have all these conspiracies about the YIMBY movement. And to my mind, it's just fairly obvious that for one of the first times in US history, a lot of young professionals realized, oh, I don't actually have a path toward owning my own home. And they became naturally very upset about that. Of course, most of them just left and go, to raise housing prices in places like Utah and Idaho and Arizona. But of those who stayed, they were like, yeah, I mean, this is very obvious that the status quo hurts me and it enriches someone who was lucky enough to buy a Bay Area home in the 70s. And that's kind of a crazy system. That's a crazy way to run a city, let alone an entire country. So from that perspective, I'm really optimistic. I mean, we're already seeing policy transfer happen. So stuff like California pioneering the preemption of accessory dwelling units, which allow homeowners to have an additional apartment in their garage or attic or basement. California has legalized those statewide, regardless of how restrictive local zoning ordinances are. And we're already seeing.
Can I just say how much I love the phrase legalize housing?
Yeah, I mean, well, and this is, I think, part of the genius of YIMBY, right? Yes, in my backyard. Like, I think there's a positive element to it, right? We're so much of planning is so reactive and so negative. And so, we had a whole generation where, being a steward of your city meant saying no and blocking things. And in a different context where you had stuff like freeways being built through neighborhoods, or you had the government coming in and actually eminent domaining an entire neighborhood, I actually think that impulse was totally valid, right? And, the people who stopped neighborhoods from getting demolished to build freeways or to build, sports stadiums, God bless them. But we're in a very different context now when that same impulse gets applied toward a fourplex or maybe a coffee shop on the corner of your street, right? Like these are very different things. This is no longer, hey, we're going to stop, large malicious actors from coming in and taking away people's homes, to we're not going to let you do what you want with your home. And also, we're just not going to allow anyone to build homes for you. But back to your question, I'm very optimistic. The conversation, to me, it seems like in a place like California, there's something like a consensus that something has to be done. I'm sure you can find troglodyte, outer wealthy suburb assembly members who are in denial about this. I know they exist. But for the most part in California, most serious people are like, okay, yeah, we have a problem. The problem is that there's just not enough supply coming online. And it comes down to a lot of these regressive zoning rules that were written 100 years ago. Let's fix it. So I'm very optimistic from that perspective.
How do you think about going about that? Like the problem I see is I think you're absolutely correct. And I think the tide has turned and people are interested in why have housing prices gone up so much, and I think a lot of people believe like it's due to zoning and a lot of things that have gone wrong there where you just can't build more housing. Supply is very fixed. But my question is like, for an individual person, it's not worth very much versus the homeowner who doesn't want, the skyscraper beside them or something that would block their zucchini garden. Like the lady with the zucchini garden, she's really motivated to keep her zucchinis growing, right? Whereas like, yes, it would be much better if my rent was like $50 less, $100 less a month, but that's spread out. And for her, it's very concentrated. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think in the near term, they've avoided this problem because I think people have a kind of need to be a part of communities like this. So
gotcha.
You're exactly right that me as an individual renter, if I go out and do YIMBY advocacy, I have basically no dreams that this is going to like lower my rent or even maybe to a lesser extent that it'll make housing cheap enough in a near enough term for me to actually buy it. So on one level, like I sort of appreciate what I'm doing as making cities cheaper for the next generation of people who are in my situation, and getting some psychic benefit from that. And also the benefit of a community. I found that these groups are really great and it's passionate. If you want to meet people who are really passionate about building more affordable, walkable, equitable cities, these are great communities to be a part of. But I think exactly to your point, right? There's some fundamental issues with the system that this is partly one of the reasons why I sort of I'm trying to move the conversation toward what comes after zoning, because you're exactly right that that incumbent property owners are always going to have some incentive to use a system like zoning to exclude. And they're going to have a much stronger incentive to show up at those meetings. And at the end of the day, they're probably almost always going to be the key special interest that's driving land use planning. And we need to think about a system that's robust to that sort of different capacity or interest in being involved in the process. That's sort of why I get to this whole need for things like scientific surveys or focus groups.
Let's get into that. What comes after the revolution? What comes after zoning? We can talk about how we get there in a bit, but what is the vision you want to implement?
Yeah, so I make the case for two things. So the first half of this is we have a city that doesn't have zoning. It's Houston. Houston's a very weird city. It's hard to refer people to zoning because I don't think Houston made so many of the other city planning mistakes of the 20th century, right? They built huge freeways. They demolished half of their downtown. They mandate parking, stuff like that. But they didn't make one mistake of 20th century planning, and that was they didn't adopt zoning. And they have a sort of unique system for making that work. Like, why did Houston not adopt zoning? One of the reasons is that they had a pretty robust system of private deed restrictions and covenants. So people in these single family home neighborhoods who had extremely strong preferences for keeping out things like neighborhood commercial uses or even multifamily basically were able to opt out of non-zoning. They had these deed restrictions. Now, people always love to say, oh, these things are basically like deed restriction, or deed restrictions are basically like zoning. Houston basically have zoning. It's not at all the case. These deed restrictions only apply to these very small pockets of where these people actually live. And so unlike in a zone city, they don't really have any say on what happens outside their little fiefdoms. They don't have any say on what happens on the commercial property that's just down the street from their subdivision.
That's interesting. And that is the case in other cities. So I, as a constituent there, can have say on what happens in a place outside of my own local community.
Yeah, or outside your, right? So you might be on a residential side street, right? And it's all single family homes, and you're in Houston, and there's a deed restriction that applies to all of them that, hey, all of us want this type of community. So we're all going to sign this agreement saying that we're not going to turn our homes into apartment buildings or office buildings. Setting aside that office buildings don't even want to be on streets like that. But at the end of the street, right, there might be like an IHOP on the corner. And as rents are going up, IHOP said, land prices are going up. IHOP says, all right, actually, this land is more valuable to us to just sell it, and then move into the residential pad or the retail pad that a developer will put in the new building, right? Perhaps. And in the Houston context, neighbors can raise a fuss, and they do, but they ultimately don't have a lot of levers for stopping that if it's outside of their little deed restricted, fiefdom.
So you're saying that like zoning, sorry to interrupt, but like basically there's a key point here I want to make sure I'm interpreting correctly, is that it seems like zoning is a way to kind of superpower the right to complain of people who don't like the direction something's going into. So so it's not just that there are organized opposition, it's that the law props up the organized opposition to have like really like super standing to complain or something like that.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I mean, the institutions effectively have that result, right? Which is that if it comes down to if enough people show up and complain, something's not going to happen, kind of regardless of what the findings are.
But it's not just like a pure democratic thing. It's like there's enough angry people who don't want this, so therefore it doesn't happen. It's like, no, it's because the law of zoning gives their votes basically much more power than other people's because they can point out that this is like against the zoning ordinance or whatever.
Well, this is I think an area where zoning in theory diverges with zoning as applied, right? Zoning in theory, that IHOP, let's say that IHOP needs a rezoning to be an apartment building. They go to the city planning commission, they make their case, they say, hey, here's all the ways that this project will advance community, ideals discussed in the comprehensive plan. Here's all these sort of community needs that this project is going to fulfill. Right. In theory, the city planning commission is supposed to make findings on these types of planning considerations. In practice, exactly to your point, we have kind of a tyranny of whoever shows up to complain. Right. And as we know from literature, the types of people who show up to complain are not very representative of the broader community. In many cases, they're older. They tend to be white. They tend to be much wealthier. I mean, when you have these planning hearings that are at 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, naturally you're going to get a certain type of person. But so zoning in practice ends up becoming this situation where it's a tyranny of whoever shows up and how they feel about the project. And so in a context like Houston, it's slightly different, right? So people within their communities, they can voluntarily opt into land use rules that might look something like an R1 zoning district, or might look something like a single family zoning district in another city. But number one, they have to voluntarily opt into it. And number two, they have no say on properties outside of the community that opted into it, without maybe buying those rights or negotiating for those rights. And that's something you do see in Houston and other unzoned contexts, is when you don't have this sort of regulatory fiat determining what can go where, neighbors actually talk to each other and they actually buy each other's rights. And they, of course, some communities are going to have more sophistication in this than others, but
so you have to pay for the right to exclude, essentially, is what you're saying. Is that it's like, if you want the right to keep your neighborhood frozen in amber, you have to buy out the other people who may not agree with you, rather than just have it as some kind of divine right.
Yeah. So, there are cases like this in unzoned contexts where, for example, you might have a residential neighborhood that the back end of it fronts against a commercial strip, right? And they have a deed restriction that applies to their neighborhood, but there's a little commercial property that could be a lot of different things. And a gas station is proposed on that property. Neighbors really don't want a gas station because they're noisy and they have floodlights and they smell bad. And so they buy out maybe the right of that property owner to develop it into a gas station. They say, we'll be fine with a strip mall, but we really don't want a gas station. So that type of Cohesion bargaining, to go back to that sort of theoretical framework, which I think is underappreciated by land use planners, it does happen and it can happen. And actually, I think there's a role for planners to play in facilitating those types of transactions, right? Because we know that the theory depends on zero transaction costs, and we know that doesn't apply to the real world. We can have land use planning frameworks that reduce those transaction costs and get people into the, at the negotiating table on, land uses or practices that maybe offend one side of the party, and get them to a point where they can reach a settlement to find mutually agreeable land uses, as opposed to this sort of the way we do it today, which is essentially relying on the regulatory fiat of 50 years ago.
Right. Okay, so your thesis is basically that not only is this going to more accurately represent the interests and desires of people who actually live in places, rather than just whoever shows up at 2 a.m. on 11 a.m. on a Tuesday, but it also is more responsive to change and needs and demands over time. Is that what you're arguing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's another big issue with zoning, right? Is that it sort of locks cities into whatever the vision was or whatever the reality was when they adopted their zoning code. So, for example, the New York City zoning code, in its current version, was adopted in 1961. That was a time when there was fear of, people are going to be leaving the city. Maybe industry might be leaving the city. So, they took a zoning code that allowed, hundreds of millions of people and dropped it down to a zoning code that allowed, 8 to 10 million people. Of course, now New York City is a very different place, and there's, significant demands within the city, but we still have this zoning code that only allows a very small number of additional people to move into the city, just based on zone capacity. So, you're exactly right. You need a more dynamic system of land use planning. I mean, the way I characterize it is emergent forms of land use planning. People are actually pretty good at setting up a lot of these institutions that they would like. The operative form of land use planning in most U.S. contexts, even where zoning exists, are private deed restrictions, neighborhood associations, HOAs. In many cases, they're much more restrictive than zoning, and people opt into them. And so, I think if people want to do that, that's perfectly fine. Obviously, we have rules for certain types of rules that we as a society don't want to see enforced by courts. So things like, racial covenants are no longer enforceable. But if you want to pull together all your neighbors and have them all sign a contract saying we're only going to do single family homes here, that's fine. Then don't try to adopt these broader zoning institutions that stop up growth elsewhere in the city. And that's essentially how Houston has avoided having zoning, is that the people with the most extreme preferences for zoning, like land use planning, got it in a way that didn't actually destroy the entire city.
So it's interesting you bring up Houston, because I grew up around Houston. I grew up in Conroe, which is just stone's throw away. And Houston, it famously doesn't have zoning. It does have the covenants. It's really interesting to hear you talk about the nuance between those, because I've often heard that that deed restrictions basically are zoning by another name. But it's interesting to hear that you take the position that they're not really, and it's interesting to get into those details. Now, one thing that a lack of zoning, you talk about Houston's other mistakes. A lack of zoning has not saved Houston from is just enormous sprawl. Like Houston, I mean, more than plenty of other cities, has just enormous sprawl. And so here is something where I'd like to do a little segue here towards the end of the show towards Will and I's mutual interest is, Georgism and land value taxation, and it's interesting sometimes in urbanism is that you see people who think like land value tax will solve this and that's all we need. And you hear some other people think, no, we don't need that at all. All we need is zoning reform, and Will and I kind of take the position that they're allied positions. They're two great tastes that taste great together. And they kind of work better at this if you have both together at the same time than individually. But I'm curious what your position is. And, do you agree? Do you disagree? What is your take on land value taxation and property tax reform alongside zoning reform? Does it help? Does it hurt? Is there really tricky nuance to get right? What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, just to sort of like start in a different place with answering that question. I mean, a city like Houston is sprawling, for reasons that probably weren't ever going to be really affected by the land use planning, or maybe even the property tax system or the land tax system you had in place, right? Houston is kind of like an urban economics model. It's a flat, featureless plain with, not a lot of like high value agricultural uses, not dissimilar to, other sort of Southwestern cities, right? So why does a city like, to a lesser extent than Houston, why does a city like Phoenix sprawl, other than where it bumps up against public land or reservations? Because there's literally no other economic use of the land. And so as soon as, you have the infrastructure in place, that those properties are going to get developed usually into single family homes.
But isn't there an argument that the infrastructure is not necessarily able to support itself, and the nature of, kind of the strong towns argument that it's like sprawling happens because it's cheaper to buy the marginal land, even if that's worse for the total economic system because speculation has driven the price up of the interior land. So you have to go get the later land, even though now you're paying more to like pave a road out there and drive sewers out there and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, although in the Houston context, I'm sure they have like a Ford F-150 Texas edition or whatever, rather than a Subaru. But no, I mean, I just wanted to start with that because people are always like, oh, well, like Houston doesn't have zoning, and look at how sprawling Houston is. Like Houston doesn't look like Boston. Well, it's like there are historical and geographical reasons why Houston doesn't look like Boston or New York, right? When you have like you have places that actually have like land constraints. Development is going to be denser just by the nature of land prices, or cities that grew up before the advent of the car are going to end up looking very, very different from cities that grew up after it. I mean, I'm not an expert in land tax issues. I mean, I'm broadly sympathetic to the argument. I think it makes sense. Of course, this is so much of the value of land is tied up in neighborhood uses, and in that sense, it is kind of a land use planning consideration, right? That so much of the value of your land comes from what your neighbors do, and also the infrastructure improvements. I think for another thing for a city like Houston, just to sort of say, why does Houston sprawl? Is it a function of non-zoning? Houston sprawls for the same reason that every major city in Texas sprawls, which is these geographical flat features plain elements, but also the city built infrastructure. They built massive roads out to the middle of green fields, and your city is going to look like the infrastructure that you plan for. So if you weren't building these huge freeways that reduce commuting times for people who live in Plano to get to downtown Dallas, then you wouldn't have sprawl all the way out there. I'm very much sympathetic to the strong towns argument that this is a pretty, a fiscally very dangerous pattern of development, and that, a lot of cities haven't fully internalized the maintenance costs and the regular rebuilding costs of a lot of this infrastructure. Back when it was still something that anyone thought was going to pass, I was, a little uneasy about some of the Build Back Better mechanisms for spending this money to build more of these freeways. I think back to your actual question about land value taxes, I think it gets the incentives aligned, right? It in terms of how people use property. One of the things I wonder with it is for, the extent to which this pushes long-term homeowners out of their property if they don't want to, right? So something that was happening in Lexington, which speaks to just how bad housing prices have gone national, that my hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, has things like gentrifying neighborhoods and rising home prices, is what was pushing out a lot of incumbent homeowners was that as more people were moving into the community, property taxes were going up. And it's property taxes, but the mechanism would have worked the same for land value, right? Like land values are going up because more people want to live in that neighborhood. So the only way they were able to kind of get out of the situation where, in many cases, retired senior homeowners were having their property bills quadruple or, quintuple was to offer some form of relief for low-income households. That's something where because I think that the basic theory makes total sense to me. But I wonder about these sort of marginal cases of like, how do we work around some of the problems with land value taxes?
Yeah,
you're the expert though, so I mean, you have interesting ideas on this.
Well, there's a lot of people you talk to. There's a lot of schools of thoughts. There's some people who want to do all sorts of political horse trading. You know what I mean? So like one of them is that it's like one of the oldest ideas, of course, is that you take a lot, all or at least a portion of the land value tax that you raise in your community and you redistribute it as a citizen's dividend, right? And what that basically makes it is that that's basically kind of your sort of abatement right there. Other people are willing to like carve out some restrictions and do some horse trading for the poor widow, so to speak, right? But the other part of the argument is that something people bring up a lot is that nobody talks about the poor widow who's a renter who gets kicked out of her place, and nobody talks about the poor widow who's homeless who can't afford a place, right? It's only the poor widow who's in a $500,000 million home who needs to pay taxes on it that anyone ever like everyone cares about her rights, but nobody cares about the other two poor widows. And so I mean, in terms of practical politics, there's a lot of roads you can go down. I think first of all, even your most ardent single tax or Georgist admits that we're not getting there overnight, and that the first step is to take your existing property tax regime and just shift it off of buildings and onto land, but collect the same amount of tax, so that really hopefully incentivize more building in various places and stuff like that, so that the supply can reach, as the population increases, housing increases too, so that it's not just this one-way ratchet. I mean, it's a big discussion. I don't want to monopolize what is your interview on this side topic, but we wanted to at least touch on it.
No, it's interesting. I mean, I think of the issues that I focus on, I think there are similar considerations, right? So in the transportation planning realm, things like congestion pricing or the pricing of on-street parking. These are things that the theory is rock solid in the same way that land value tax makes sense. And I think that the conversations actually come down to political conversations of, how do you adopt these things in ways that or how do you organize these things in ways that actually get passed, right? So you mentioned just paying out a dividend. I think that actually is pretty underrated as a policy mechanism. Or, in the parking context, right? I work with Donald Shoup here at UCLA, and his idea of how do we get neighborhoods to voluntarily adopt on-street parking pricing? Well, you set aside all the money that's generated by streets in that neighborhood, and you put it into a pot for repaving streets in that neighborhood, planting street trees, improving services in that community. So people can immediately see the benefits of the system, right? Or with stuff like congestion pricing, you take some of that money and you use it to improve the quality of transportation infrastructure. Or just like you said, you just pay a dividend. So I mean, I think it's really fascinating, and I'm a little bit more curious about progress on that. To my knowledge, there aren't any cities talking about going over to pure land value tax. I know Pennsylvania has pockets where they do split roll or something like that. But yeah, that would be an interesting. I mean, there are all these other conversations that need to happen to make cities work. That I think, like getting land use planning fixed, is like a near-term thing. But public finance and transportation planning are two other cans of worms that we can open up once we've solved housing affordability.
Will, I think there's an LVT proposal in Richmond, Virginia, isn't there?
Richmond's the big one right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's it's coming back. It used to be this thing that was like kind of this crazy idea that everyone had forgotten about, but it's coming back in a lot of ways in small and incremental measures. But there's a lot of renewed interest in it, as you can tell, along with just YIMBYism together. They're kind of correlated ideas for good reason, because they work together, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. I think ideas can move a lot quicker than we realize. I mean, if you had told me that California was going to effectively abolish single family zoning in 5 years, if you had told me that in 2016, I would think you're completely crazy.
You could have made a lot of easy money off of me on a bet against it.
Right. Or if you had told me that like in 2022, most major cities were going to have either abolished their minimum parking requirements or we're going to be pretty close to that, I would say like, okay, you're extremely optimistic and God bless you.
And minimal parking requirements are like, you must build this much parking with each new development or whatever. Is that what you're talking about specifically for the benefit of the listeners?
That's correct. Yeah. So it says if you want to build an apartment building, you have to also build a parking garage with one or two spaces per apartment. Or if you want to build a supermarket, you have to build a giant surface lot. And this is one of those things that just when you understand these rules and you know what they are, it sort of helps you explain why the U.S. urban landscape looks like what it does.
Can I just segue back to the SimCity vision? One thing that's really interesting is that if you go and you play SimCity or the new incarnation by a totally different company, City Skylines, you'll notice the lack of parking, the conspicuous lack of parking. If you compare it to an overhead aerial photograph of actual American cities, like the amount of surface parking versus what you see in these little city planning games, there's no parking. And if you interview the developers, they're like very aware of it, but they said it's like, well, if you do that, the cities are ugly and it's not fun and it's not as interesting. And so we just kind of pretended that there's infinite underground, just free parking for everything. Like the little car just arrives at the building and then disappears, you know? Yep. And I think that's kind of very telling that aesthetically, you know, like we kind of have that preference and, you know, but in real life, like we have these like splayed out parking lots just everywhere.
No, absolutely. I mean, this gets back to the way we started the conversation almost perfectly. You don't have giant parking lots in SimCity. You're not. There's no threat that you're going to get fired in SimCity.
Yep.
In a way that you might if you're an actual city planner. There's no public hearings where people will show up and yell at you. You know, I comment on. I did a 20-year retrospective on SimCity in Reason Magazine, and I try to sort of comment on all of this and the irony of this game inspiring a generation of people to go into city planning and sort of the rude awakening that we all collectively got when we actually went out and discovered how dysfunctional U.S. city planning institutions were. But like I was saying, I'm optimistic about a lot of this stuff, and I think there's a lot of great people doing fantastic work, and we're seeing really good policy ideas spread, and a lot of really great people enter this space and do really interesting research and activism. So I'm optimistic. And then, of course, once my book comes out, it'll definitively solve all these problems.
That's great.
We're good to go. Well, Nolan, thank you so much for taking the time to come on today. I know we've got to get you to a class you're teaching this evening. Where can people find your book? When's it coming out? Where would you like to send people?
Sure. Yeah. So you can pre-order a book. It's coming out in June. You can pre-orders are open on Island Press or on Amazon.
What's the title again?
Arbitrary Lines, How Zoning Broke the American City and How We're Going to Fix It.
That sounds like a great read.
The working title was actually Against Zoning, but my editor insisted that was a little too harsh. And she was obviously right, and that's why editors make the good thoughts. But awesome. Arbitrary Lines, it's open for pre-orders. And in the meantime, I'm on Twitter. You know, I'm very chatty on Twitter and as the safe haven for YIMBY activism and also George's. So you can follow me there, M. Nolan Gray. But thanks again for having me. This is a really interesting conversation.
No, thanks very much, Nolan. I learned a lot. I'm really interested. We'll have to make I'm actually a game developer as my actual job. So one day I kind of have dreams of doing an urbanist take on SimCity that like actually grapples with all the annoying things that are actually like really, really salient.
Well, my issue with SimCity is you can't do a city without zoning. You have to have zoning.
Oh yeah. It's just assumed. Like I remember playing it on like the Super Nintendo and just being like, so that's how you make all cities ever, and that's just the basic of everything. Fun fact, I never built any industrial zones in any of my cities because I didn't want any of the pollution. And so like I had cities where you could live and you could shop, but you couldn't work. Well, and somehow, you know, the game never punished me for that, which is hilarious. But you know what? At every single thing, this was like kind of a prelude to what would happen in my life later. At every little like time it would tell you what the issues in your city was, everyone was like, housing costs, they're too high. And I was like, but what's the problem? I increased the land value as much as possible. Why is everyone mad?
Well, yeah, it sounds only slightly more incoherent than the typical actual zoning ordinance.
Right.
Cool. Well, Nolan,
thanks, Nolan.
we're really glad you had us on. We had you on, and Will, thank you for allowing me to, become your kind of stealth co-host here, just worming my way into the podcast.
Love it. Well, thanks, Nolan.
Thank you.
Bye.